Rabbi Eliav Ben-Shimon had always believed he was born for one purpose: to preserve the sacred traditions of his people. From the time he was a boy growing up in the tight-knit Jewish community of Brooklyn, he had been taught that the Torah was not merely a book. It was the living breath of God. His father, and his father before him, were both revered rabbis. Their home was filled with scrolls, prayers, and debates over ancient texts, and Eliav soaked it all in like a sponge. By the time he was 12, he could recite long passages from memory. By 16, he was already tutoring younger students. And by the time he was ordained in his late 20s, he had become known as one of the most brilliant Torah scholars in his borough. He was respected, admired, even sought after by rabbis across the city for his sharp insight into the Talmud and his unwavering commitment to halakha, the Jewish law. But there was one subject that always stirred something deeper, something colder, in Eliav's heart: Jesus of Nazareth. To him, the name was synonymous with deception. He had studied Christian claims in detail, not to consider them, but to dismantle them. He knew the verses Christians often quoted, and he had well-rehearsed counter-arguments for each one. To Eliav, the New Testament was a dangerous document, built on what he believed were twisted interpretations of Hebrew prophecy. He had debated pastors, refuted missionaries, and even written articles for religious journals, explaining why Jesus could not possibly be the Jewish Messiah. His confidence wasn't just intellectual, it was foundational. His entire identity rested on the belief that he, and those like him, were guarding the truth. Still, beneath all his knowledge, there lingered a quiet, unspoken fear. He would never admit it, not to his congregation, not to his students, and certainly not to himself. But in the stillness of night, when the house was quiet and the city had settled into its sleep, he sometimes wondered if he had truly done enough. Did God see him as righteous? Had he observed the commandments with enough care? Was his heart pure enough to be accepted by the Almighty? These questions would flicker and fade, quickly suppressed by years of training and certainty. But they never vanished completely. By the time he turned 68, Eliav had lived a life that many would envy. He had a devoted wife, grown children who still lived nearby, and a small but faithful congregation. Every Sabbath, he would stand at the front of the synagogue, wrapped in his tallit, teaching with fire and clarity about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He led prayers with solemnity, read from the Torah with reverence, and answered questions with the authority of a man who had studied his entire life. So when he began experiencing mild stomach issues, just discomfort after eating, maybe a little acid reflux, he didn't think much of it. His doctor suggested a routine endoscopy, nothing major. Outpatient, in and out in a few hours. Eliav nodded, made the appointment, and told his wife not to worry. "It's just to be safe," he said with a reassuring smile. "They do these all the time." He had no idea that the procedure would take him beyond the veil of this world. The morning of the procedure was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of stillness that hangs in the air before a summer thunderstorm, though the sky over Brooklyn was bright and blue. Rabbi Eliav Ben-Shimon sat in the passenger seat of his wife Miriam's silver sedan, his tall frame wrapped in a simple navy coat, his yarmulke neatly pinned in place. They had driven to Mount Sinai, Brooklyn, just under 3 miles from their brownstone. He wasn't nervous. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. "It's outpatient," he reminded her with a warm squeeze of her hand as they pulled into the parking lot. "You'll be reading the Torah portion to me by dinner." Miriam offered a soft smile, but her eyes didn't match. She had been married to Eliav for over 40 years. She had seen him speak with unwavering conviction before packed synagogues, hold his ground during heated theological debates, and bury grieving members of their congregation with grace and dignity. But she had also seen the rare moments of silence, when the rabbi's heart asked questions. His lips would never speak. Today, something about that silence returned. They checked in at the hospital around 8:45 a.m. A nurse led them to pre-op, where Eliav changed into a paper gown and lay back on the hospital bed, IV already taped to his arm. The room smelled like antiseptic and faintly of fresh linens. It was cold, even under the warm blanket they provided. A young anesthesiologist came in, explained the process cheerfully, and asked Eliav to count backward once the medication started flowing. He barely made it to 97. At first, everything was ordinary. Then suddenly, it wasn't. A faint buzzing filled his ears. His chest tightened, though there was no pain, only an unfamiliar heaviness, like something sacred had shifted in the atmosphere. The fluorescent lights above him blurred into streaks. Somewhere in the room, alarms began to beep. A single one at first, then others. The nurse shouted for epinephrine. Footsteps echoed. The anesthesiologist's voice grew louder, more urgent. Then came the paddles. A defibrillator. Flatline. But Eliav didn't see any of it from the bed, because he was no longer lying there. He was above it. He floated effortlessly several feet from the ceiling, looking down on the scene like a silent observer. He saw the team working frantically on his body, compressing his chest, adjusting the monitors, checking his pupils. His face was pale, lifeless. Yet he wasn't afraid. Confused, yes, but oddly calm. "What is this?" he whispered, or thought he whispered. His voice didn't echo. No one below heard him. He turned, instinctively trying to grab onto something, but there was nothing to grasp. Just air, space, stillness. And that stillness deepened into silence. Then the world began to fade. Not all at once. Like the slow dimming of theater lights after the final act. The walls of the hospital blurred, then dissolved. The sounds of medical equipment melted away into a deafening quiet. Time itself lost shape. Eliav didn't feel like he was moving, but something was pulling him. Gently at first, like a soft breeze curling through a half-open window. Then it grew stronger, firmer. He had no control, no weight, no direction. He was being taken, not by force, but by purpose. The colors around him darkened, shifting into shades of charcoal and indigo. A darkness not just of absence, but of mystery. Yet there was no terror, no torment. Only the sense that something was waiting. Then, light. It appeared as a speck, so small he almost missed it, but it grew rapidly. It didn't blind him, it invited him. It was alive. It pulsed with a warmth deeper than fire, more ancient than time. The pull intensified. The darkness could no longer hold him. He was moving toward the light, and within that light, something, or someone, stood. At first he couldn't make out the figure, but as it stepped forward, radiating authority without violence, love without weakness, Eliav's soul trembled. Not from fear, but from recognition. His breath caught, though he no longer had lungs. His thoughts stilled. The man standing before him was Jesus. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. And yet, it was. Eliav tried to look away, but he couldn't. His entire life he had taught that Jesus was a false teacher, a misguided prophet, perhaps even a danger to the Jewish people. He had dismantled Christian doctrine with surgical precision. And now here he stood, face to face with the very man he had denied. His knees buckled, not physically but spiritually. He collapsed before the glory. He was not worthy to stand. Not anymore. Jesus looked at him, not with judgment, not with vengeance, but with something far more disarming. Love. Love that burned through every defense. Love that saw every flaw and did not retreat. Love that broke every layer of pride Rabbi Eliav had ever built. In that moment, Eliav didn't feel anger or confusion, or even fear. He felt undone, and yet he felt known. He didn't know how long he had been in that space between the worlds, but one thing was now certain: nothing would ever be the same again. For what felt like both a single heartbeat and an eternal pause, Rabbi Eliav Ben-Shimon remained suspended in that glowing space, the figure of Jesus standing before him in radiant silence. There were no clouds, no harps, no golden gates like the ones painted on chapel walls. And yet, there was majesty. There was awe. The kind that pressed gently on the soul, not with fear, but with a reverence that went deeper than words could carry. The light surrounding Jesus was unlike anything Eliav had ever encountered. It didn't shine like the sun or flicker like flame. It pulsed, alive, personal, all-consuming. Eliav wanted to speak, but his mouth didn't exist. He wanted to run, but he had no feet. Instead, he simply fell, or rather, his spirit collapsed inward. For the first time in his life, he wasn't standing in front of a scroll or a congregation or a debate hall. He was standing in front of the truth. He had spent 6 decades parsing sacred texts, mastering Aramaic commentaries, memorizing the mitzvot, and dissecting the words of Moses, David, Isaiah, and Elijah. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. And in a silence that spoke louder than any human voice, Jesus looked at him and said the words that shattered everything Eliav had built his identity upon. "You have studied the scriptures, yet you have not truly known me." The words pierced him, not like a spear, but like a light shining into the deepest places of the soul he hadn't even realized were hidden. Eliav didn't feel anger or accusation in the voice of Jesus. He felt sorrow. Deep, aching sorrow. Not disappointment like a scolding teacher, but the sorrow of a father who had waited patiently for his son to return, only to be turned away time and again. Eliav tried to respond, to defend himself, to explain all the years he had labored to keep the commandments, to honor the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he couldn't, because in that moment, as he looked into the eyes of Jesus, he saw something terrifyingly beautiful. He saw everything. His life unfolded before him in images, not as he remembered them, but as they truly were. He saw himself as a young boy reciting Torah before his father, proud and eager. He saw the years in yeshiva, the lectures, the arguments, the quiet longing in the early mornings when he wondered if God was truly near. He saw the faces of people he had taught, not just their names, but their hearts. And then, most painfully, he saw the moments Jesus had come close. Moments when someone had planted a seed, an invitation, a passage from Isaiah, a simple question, and he had turned away in pride. The realization landed like a thunderclap. I wasn't defending the truth, he thought. I was defending my understanding of it. Jesus didn't speak again, not with words. He simply opened his hands. And what Eliav saw next was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The scriptures came alive, not metaphorically but literally. They unfolded before him like a great tapestry stretching across eternity. The Hebrew texts he knew by heart began to shimmer with new meaning. Verses he had memorized suddenly realigned, like stars forming constellations he had never noticed. From Genesis to Malachi, everything pointed to the man standing before him. Every law, every feast, every prophecy, every psalm. He saw the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. He was pierced for our transgressions. And for the first time, he didn't see Israel. He saw Jesus, crucified, bleeding, rejected, and somehow, still full of compassion. He saw Psalm 22. They have pierced my hands and feet. They divide my garments among them. And watched the Roman soldiers gamble for Jesus' robe beneath the cross. Not a story, a vision. He saw Zechariah's words. They will look upon me, the one they have pierced, and mourn for him, and felt the heartbreak of an entire nation realizing too late what they had missed. Then Eliav saw his own face among them. Tears, if such things existed in this realm, flowed from deep within his being. How had he not seen this? How had he read these words 1,000 times and missed the one to whom they all pointed? And yet, in the middle of his grief, something strange happened. He felt warmth. He felt the light wrapping around him, not to expose, but to embrace. Jesus stepped forward, not with fire or fury, but with grace. The kind of grace that didn't demand perfection. The kind of grace that had waited patiently for 68 years, through stubbornness, through rebellion, through intellectual pride. In that moment, Eliav understood something he had never allowed himself to believe. Jesus wasn't the enemy of Judaism. He was its fulfillment. He was the long-awaited Messiah, not the conquering king of politics and power, but the suffering servant who came to heal the broken, to bind up the wounded, to restore what centuries of tradition could never fully reconcile, the human heart to its creator. Eliav wept, not because he was ashamed, but because he was finally free. Rabbi Eliav Ben-Shimon didn't know how long he had stood there, if time even existed in this space. All he knew was that his soul had been stripped bare. He had come face to face with the one person he had denied his entire life, and rather than judgment, he had found mercy. Rather than wrath, he had encountered a love so pure it undid everything he thought he knew about God. Now, that love was leading him somewhere deeper. The radiant light that had surrounded Jesus didn't fade. It expanded, not like a sudden burst of brightness, but like a curtain slowly drawing back, unveiling something so vast, so majestic, that Eliav could scarcely breathe, if breathing had still been a part of his reality. What he saw next was no longer just Jesus standing before him. It was a kingdom, an eternal city bathed in light not from the sun or moon, but from the presence of God himself. It stretched farther than his eyes could follow, rolling hills of golden grass, crystal rivers that shimmered with color, and trees whose leaves seemed to hum with life itself. The gates of this city didn't swing open with thunder or ceremony. They simply welcomed. The very atmosphere pulsed with holiness and peace, and yet Eliav felt the weight of it press into him, not crushing but awakening. Everything inside him longed to step forward, to belong, to be home. And for a brief moment he thought he had arrived, that this was it. This was heaven. But then Jesus turned toward him, eyes solemn, voice quiet, yet unshakably clear. "This is my Father's kingdom," he said, "and all who believe in me are welcome here." Eliav's heart surged with longing, but his joy halted at the edge of that final phrase, "all who believe in me." For the first time since leaving his body, a deep ache stirred within him. What about those who didn't? Those who had devoted themselves to God through tradition, discipline, study, but never knew the Messiah? What about those like him, those still alive, who had built entire lives around the Torah, and yet were blind to the one it pointed toward? As if hearing his thoughts, Jesus lifted a hand, and suddenly the view shifted. Eliav was no longer standing before the gates. Instead, he found himself looking across a great distance, an unfathomable divide between light and shadow. On the other side was something entirely different. There was no fire, no brimstone, no screaming. In fact, it was the absence that was most haunting. A great plain of stillness. Not peace, but silence. Not rest, but separation. He saw souls, countless souls. Some stood alone. Others clung to faded garments of self-righteousness or tradition. Many were looking around as though searching for something, or someone, but finding only more emptiness. Their expressions weren't twisted in horror, but in regret. Deep, soul-cutting regret. And Eliav understood in an instant. This was the fate of those who had chosen law over grace, works over faith, knowledge over relationship. It wasn't that God had cast them away. They had walked away from him, convinced they could reach heaven by their own merit. "No one is sent here," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "They choose it. They chose to live without me, and now they exist apart from me." Eliav's knees buckled. His heart, though not physical, ached with a grief that felt deeper than any pain he had known on earth. These weren't strangers. These were his people, scholars, friends, family, men and women who had sat at his table, studied with him, prayed beside him in the synagogue. People he had taught, week after week, urging them to pursue righteousness through law, sacrifice, and heritage. And he had been wrong. Horribly, tragically wrong. He turned toward Jesus, the words torn from his soul. "What happens to them?" Jesus didn't respond right away. His gaze remained on the shadowed horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked, not from weakness, but from immeasurable grief. "They would not come, so I let them go." Eliav wanted to scream, to weep, to fall apart, but instead he stood, shoulders shaking, soul stripped, and whispered, "Then what of me?" Jesus turned to him, eyes now brimming with compassion. "You still have a choice." In that moment, the light shifted once more. The gates reappeared. The music of worship rose in the distance. Eliav could feel it drawing him in, calling him home. Never in his entire life had he felt so welcomed, so safe, so loved. This was what his soul had been searching for since the moment it first cried out to God as a child. This was the fullness of everything the Torah had pointed toward. The rest promised in the Sabbath, the mercy foreshadowed in the sacrifices, the intimacy hinted at in the burning bush. And yet, something held him back. Not fear, conviction. There were still people walking the same road he had once walked. Still souls clinging to tradition, utterly convinced they were following the true God while unknowingly rejecting his Son. Still men like him, rabbinical students, scholars, elders, devoted to the law, but blind to grace. He could not stay, not yet, not while they still had a chance to see what he had seen. "I want to go back," he said, turning to Jesus, voice trembling. "Send me back. Let me tell them." Jesus looked at him, not with surprise, but with solemn affirmation. He reached out, placing his hand on Eliav's shoulder. The warmth of it wasn't just comforting, it was commissioning. "Then speak," he said. "Tell them what you have seen. But remember, not all will listen, yet you must speak anyway." And with those words, the kingdom faded. The light withdrew like a sunrise running in reverse. The air turned cool. The sound of worship dimmed into silence. Eliav felt his spirit pulled, gently at first, then suddenly, violently, rushing through space, through time, through the veil of eternity. His body awaited, broken, fragile, but not empty. And then, pain. A sudden gasp, a sharp, searing ache in his chest, beeping, voices, bright hospital lights overhead, and the sound of someone shouting, "We've got a pulse." The voices came in waves, faint at first, like echoes from underwater, then louder, urgent, familiar. His heart's beating again. "I need vitals, blood pressure, O2, now." "Rabbi Ben-Shimon, can you hear me?" "Rabbi, squeeze my hand." Eliav gasped. It wasn't just the rush of air flooding his lungs. It was the agony of being stuffed back into a shell that suddenly felt too small, too heavy. Every joint screamed. His chest burned as if a truck had run over it. The world was spinning. The bright fluorescent lights above him buzzed with a cold, sterile hum. He blinked against their glare, trying to understand where he was. For a moment, he wanted to cry out, "Take me back. Back to the warmth, back to the light, back to Jesus." But instead his dry lips parted, and with the hoarse whisper of a man freshly torn from eternity, he spoke one word. Jesus. Silence fell over the room like a curtain. The nurses exchanged glances. One stepped out to call the doctor. Another checked the monitors with practiced detachment. But across the foot of the hospital bed, standing frozen with wide eyes and trembling hands, was Miriam, his wife, the same woman who had driven him to this very hospital just hours earlier, who had kissed his hand and said she'd be right there when he woke up. Now she was pale as parchment, staring at the man she loved like he was a ghost returned from the grave. "Eliav," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What? What did you say?" He turned his head toward her, every movement stiff with pain. His eyes, though red and watery, were clearer than ever. He had seen something no man could ever unsee. "I saw him," he croaked. "I saw Jesus." Her face twisted in confusion and fear. "You're delirious," she said, half to herself, half in hope that maybe this was just the medication talking. "You need to rest. You just died, Eliav. Your heart stopped. They said—" Her voice broke. "You shouldn't even be here." But he was. He shouldn't be. But he was. And what he brought back with him could not be contained. "The scriptures," he whispered. "They all point to him. Isaiah, Daniel, Zechariah. I saw it, Miriam. He showed me. Everything I taught, every sermon, every line. I was blind. He is the Messiah." Miriam stepped back. Not because he had yelled, his voice was barely audible, but because his words struck like thunder. She wasn't alone in the room. 2 of their grown children had arrived, Michael and Rachel. Michael, their eldest, had followed in his father's footsteps, now a respected Hebrew scholar in his own right. Rachel, a quiet but devout woman, worked in community outreach for the synagogue. Both had been praying silently in the corner while their father hovered between life and death. Now, those prayers turned into shocked silence. Michael was the first to speak. "Dad, you've been through something traumatic. It's common to hallucinate under anesthesia. You probably saw some image from your subconscious. A dream, maybe. That's all." But Eliav shook his head weakly. "Number, this wasn't a dream. This was real. More real than this room. More real than these machines, this pain, this body." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Abba, please. You're scaring us." "I was scared too," Eliav whispered. "But not of him. I was scared because I knew. I'd spent my life running from the one I claimed to be waiting for." He tried to sit up, but the pain in his chest forced him back. Instead, he reached out a trembling hand toward his wife. "Miriam, I need you to hear me. Please. I saw him. I stood before Jesus. And he didn't condemn me. He loved me." She didn't take his hand. Instead, her own hands trembled at her sides, her lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. Her eyes welled with disbelief. And something deeper. Betrayal. "You're confused," she said finally. "You're still under sedation. You don't know what you're saying." "I do," he replied, firmer now. "I've never known anything more clearly. Jesus is the Messiah." The air in the hospital room grew colder. The beep of the heart monitor was the only sound filling the void. Michael turned away, his jaw tight. Rachel wiped her eyes and sat down without a word. Miriam looked at her husband as if he were someone else entirely. And in a way, he was. The man lying in that hospital bed was not the same man who had entered Mount Sinai, Brooklyn hours earlier, expecting a simple procedure and a quiet evening at home. That man had been a rabbi of reputation, a man of law, a defender of tradition. This man had met the truth face to face, and had returned to tell the story. And already he was paying the price. Over the next few days, Eliav's body began to heal, but his world began to fracture. Word spread quickly through the community. First whispers among family, then ripples through the synagogue. The beloved Rabbi Ben-Shimon, known for his fierce opposition to Christianity, was now speaking about Jesus? Surely not. It had to be false, a misunderstanding, an exaggeration. But it wasn't. Eliav didn't hide. He spoke quietly but firmly to every person who came to visit him. He didn't debate. He didn't preach. He just told the truth. What he had seen, what he had heard, and what he now knew with absolute certainty. Jesus was not an impostor. He was the promised one. Some visitors listened politely, then left and never returned. Others became angry, accusing him of heresy, of dishonoring his ancestors. A few wept, not out of belief but heartbreak, believing that something in Eliav had broken during the surgery, that the man they loved had slipped away in more ways than one. But Eliav never raised his voice. He didn't try to force understanding. He simply bore witness, because he had seen the light. He had stood at the edge of eternity. He had seen souls lost not because God had rejected them, but because they had rejected his Son. He had seen the joy of heaven and the ache of separation. And he had been given a second chance, not to reclaim his old life, but to offer truth to those still searching, still clinging to rituals, still hoping law would do what only grace could. One evening, as the sun set beyond the Brooklyn skyline, painting the window of his hospital room in hues of orange and gold, Eliav closed his eyes and whispered the name again. Jesus. There was no applause, no choir of angels, no bright light, just peace. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at home, even if for now that home was a hospital bed, and the road ahead was paved with loss, misunderstanding, and sacrifice. But he would not stop. Not now. Not ever. Weeks passed. The sterile hospital sheets were replaced by the creased cotton of his own bed. The scent of antiseptic gave way to the faint aroma of Miriam's home-cooked lentil soup, though she no longer set a second spoon at the table. The man who had once stood proudly behind the bema, wrapped in tallit and flanked by reverent students, now sat quietly by the window of his Brooklyn brownstone, wrapped instead in solitude. Rabbi Eliav Ben-Shimon had returned from the edge of eternity, not with a triumphant announcement, but with a burden burning inside his bones. He had seen Jesus, the Messiah of Israel, the fulfillment of every line of Torah, the beating heart behind every prophecy. And he had been sent back with a mission, to speak, to tell, to warn. But no one wanted to hear it. His wife no longer spoke more than a few words each day. His children had distanced themselves with polite sorrow and quiet disbelief. Friends he had prayed beside for decades now crossed the street when they saw him walking toward the kosher market. Some neighbors even stopped inviting him for Sabbath meals. There were whispers at the synagogue, then closed doors, then an official notice from the board. His teachings were no longer in alignment with their doctrine. His title was revoked. His office keys were taken. His name removed from the weekly bulletin. Just like that, Eliav went from being a pillar of his community to a stranger in his own city. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. Because the truth wasn't a theory to him anymore. It wasn't just a theological claim or a controversial opinion. It was a person. He had seen him. He had stood in his presence. He had heard his voice. The words still echoed in his soul like the bell that calls a weary traveler home. You have studied the scriptures, yet you have not truly known me. Eliav now spent his mornings reading the New Testament, something he had once scoffed at as heretical nonsense. But now, it felt like water to a man, long parched. Every page came alive. The words of Jesus weren't just familiar. They were exactly what he had heard in the realm beyond time. He read of Nicodemus, the rabbi who came in secret, unsure of what to believe. He wept over Paul, the persecutor turned apostle. He marveled at how the very disciples he had once dismissed were men like him, flawed, searching, stubborn, and yet chosen. Still, the loneliness lingered. Until one Sunday morning, a letter arrived. There was no return address, only a simple ivory envelope with his name handwritten in careful cursive. Inside was a single card. "You are not alone. We have seen him too. Come Tuesday, 7 p.m., 145 Tremont Street, basement fellowship room." Eliav stared at it for a long while. It could be a trap, or a cruel joke, or maybe, just maybe, someone else had stood before the same light. When Tuesday arrived, he hesitated at the door. The building was old, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered shoe repair shop. The stairs leading to the basement were narrow, and the hallway smelled of mildew. But when he opened the door, what he saw stunned him. A dozen men and women sat in folding chairs, all ages, all backgrounds. An elderly woman with a prayer shawl, a young man with yarmulke and tattooed wrists, a former Orthodox couple sitting hand in hand. And at the front stood a man in his early 70s, tall and lean, with eyes that had clearly seen more than most. "Welcome," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm David, and we've been waiting for you." Eliav took the hand, and for the first time since heaven, he didn't feel alone. The room filled with testimonies, some quiet, some trembling, some spoken through tears. A Catholic nun who had died during surgery and encountered Jesus. A secular Israeli professor who had a heart attack on a plane and heard the words, "I am the way." A former imam who had seen the crucified Christ in a dream so vivid it changed everything. And now they gathered, not as a church, not as a sect, but as those who had seen and could not unsee. It was here that Eliav first spoke publicly, not in a synagogue, not on a stage, but in that humble fellowship room. He told them everything: the Torah, the light, the voice, the gates, the choice, the pain, the return. His voice trembled, his hands shook, but when he finished, there wasn't applause, only stillness. And in that stillness, understanding. They understood what it meant to be rejected, to be called a traitor, to lose everything. But more than that, they understood what it meant to gain the truth. They called themselves the remnant, not because they believed they were special, but because they had come to realize that the road was narrow, and few found it. They met weekly, prayed for their families, studied both the Tanakh and the New Testament, and supported one another when the world turned cold. It was here that Eliav also began to write, not essays of argument, but letters of testimony. He mailed his story to other rabbis, to old students, to family members who had cut him off. Not all responded. Some returned the envelopes unopened. Others sent back angry notes or pleas to repent of his apostasy. But a few, just a few, wrote back with questions. "Tell me more. I'm not sure what to believe anymore. I had a dream last year. Could it mean something?" And those 3 words echoed again. "Tell them everything." So Eliav did. He began filming his testimony, sitting in front of a borrowed camera in David's living room. He shared his story online. He told it on podcasts. Eventually, a Christian media group picked it up and translated it into multiple languages. People around the world began to hear of the rabbi who died, met Jesus, and came back to tell the truth. Still, not everyone believed. Still, the pain of rejection remained. But Eliav never regretted the cost, because he had tasted eternity, and there was no tradition, no acceptance, no earthly comfort that could compare to what he had seen. One evening, as he walked home alone through the quiet Brooklyn streets, a voice called out. "Rabbi?" He turned. A teenage boy stood under a street lamp, nervously twisting his backpack strap. "Is it true?" the boy asked. "What they say about you? About Jesus?" Eliav didn't rush to answer. He stepped forward gently, met the boy's eyes, and said the only thing he could. "Come. Let me tell you what I saw." And in that moment, he knew. His mission had only just begun. Rabbi Eliav Ben-Shimon, now a man transformed by experiences that defied every tenet of his former life, stood on the threshold of a new destiny, a destiny marked not by the rigid doctrines of tradition, but by the living, breathing grace of a love that transcended time and human frailty. In the quiet solitude of his modest Brooklyn study, where once the worn pages of the Torah lined his shelves and his voice rang with the authority of a revered teacher, he now penned his final reflections on the journey that had taken him from the familiar confines of his faith to the very gates of eternity, and back again. His heart, still heavy with the weight of rejection from those he had once called his community, pulsed with an urgency born of witnessing firsthand the stark contrast between the promise of heaven and the emptiness of a life lived without the revelation of Jesus, the Messiah. He recalled the long-ago days when he had been a stalwart defender of the ancient laws, a guardian of traditions passed down through generations, steadfastly opposing the very figure who had now, in the light of his near-death encounter, become the center of all truth. His memories swirled like the autumn leaves falling along Brooklyn's familiar sidewalks, vivid recollections of lectures delivered with fervor, debates that echoed off synagogue walls, and quiet nights spent in prayer that had, unbeknownst to him, left his soul yearning for something more than the legalistic certainty he had clung to. Now, as he reflected on that fateful day in the hospital, when a routine endoscopic procedure, a procedure meant to be as ordinary as an afternoon trip to the local clinic, had taken an unforeseen turn due to a rare adverse reaction to anesthesia, Eliav remembered how his heart had stopped, how his spirit had risen above his mortal form, and how he had been pulled into a realm of indescribable light and presence. In that surreal, suspended moment, he had seen the face of Jesus, radiant, compassionate, and inexorably real, a vision that shattered the barriers of his preconceived notions and laid bare the truth of Scripture, where every prophecy, every line of the ancient texts he had so meticulously studied, pointed directly to the suffering servant who had come not as a conqueror wielding might, but as a humble healer offering grace. That encounter had been a revelation, one that unraveled the very fabric of his identity, forcing him to confront the painful realization that his lifelong pursuit of righteousness had been a misguided endeavor, built not on a personal connection with the divine, but on the sterile recitation of words that, without the living truth, were as empty as the silent echoes in the deserted hallways of a once bustling synagogue. And so, after returning to the physical world, a world that greeted him with cold hospital lights and the pained, unsure expressions of family members, Eliav had embarked on a solitary crusade. His public testimony, though met with scorn by many in his former community, began to gather the broken and the curious in a small basement on Tremont Street, where a motley assembly of souls, survivors of their own near-death revelations, found solace and the courage to embrace a truth that defied conventional wisdom. In that humble fellowship room, amid whispered testimonies and trembling declarations of faith, Eliav discovered a kinship that transcended denominational boundaries. He listened intently as others recounted their own mystical encounters. A Catholic nun, whose near-fatal operation had granted her visions of a compassionate Savior. A secular professor who had experienced an inexplicable transformation after a heart attack mid-flight. And even a former imam whose dreams had been haunted by the image of the crucified Christ. Together they called themselves the Remnant, not out of pride, but as a solemn acknowledgement that the journey toward divine understanding was a narrow path, one that few had the fortitude to traverse. Yet it was in this shared space of vulnerability and revelation that Rabbi Eliav's purpose truly crystallized. He began to write letters, testimonies filled with raw emotion and unyielding conviction, sent to old colleagues, former students, and even distant family members who had once dismissed his radical transformation as delirium brought on by anesthesia. Some returned his words with anger, others with silent indifference. But a small, persistent few responded with heartfelt inquiries and the silent hope of redemption. Undeterred, Eliav expanded his ministry beyond the confines of his crumbling former world, embracing modern media and digital platforms to share his story far and wide. He recorded his testimony on video, his voice resonating with the quiet authority of a man who had stared into the face of eternity, and uploaded it to the internet, where it traveled across states and continents, igniting both controversy and a renewed sense of spiritual yearning among the disillusioned and the downtrodden. Even as his physical strength waned, his spirit burned brighter than ever, a beacon of hope for those who found themselves caught at the crossroads of tradition and grace. And so, on a cool evening, when the setting sun painted the Brooklyn skyline with hues of amber and gold, a palette that reminded him of that transcendent light from his near-death experience, Rabbi Eliav stood before a modest gathering in his own living room. His audience, though small and composed mostly of strangers who had come seeking answers, listened with rapt attention as he recounted his journey from the rigid confines of religious orthodoxy to the liberating, albeit painful, embrace of a faith that recognized the central role of Jesus as the fulfillment of every ancient promise. His voice, at once gentle and resolute, carried the weight of every lesson learned through hardship and divine encounter. "I have seen the light," he declared, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And I have been given a choice that I have made, not for my own salvation, but for the salvation of all who remain lost in the labyrinth of tradition. You too must decide. Will you cling to the familiar, or will you dare to step into the unknown, into the grace that awaits those who believe? Time is short, and the path is narrow. The truth is not mine to guard alone. It is a gift meant to be shared with every soul yearning for redemption." In that moment, as the room fell silent and hearts stirred with a mix of hope and trepidation, Rabbi Eliav Ben-Shimon knew that his journey was far from over. Instead, it was merely the beginning of a new chapter, one where his voice, tempered by suffering and illuminated by divine grace, would serve as a clarion call to those still standing at the crossroads of life and eternity. And though the road ahead promised resistance, rejection, and heartache, he was ready to march forward, buoyed by the certainty that true faith, once ignited, could never be dimmed by the darkness of disbelief. The story of Rabbi Eliav Ben-Shimon carries timeless and deeply personal lessons, ones especially meaningful to those in the later seasons of life. At its heart, the message is simple yet profound. It's never too late to encounter the truth. Eliav spent nearly 7 decades rooted in religious tradition, scholarship, and devotion to law, believing with all sincerity that his understanding was complete. Yet, in a moment of divine grace, he discovered that all his knowledge had pointed to someone he had long rejected: Jesus, the Messiah. This revelation wasn't a condemnation of his past, but an invitation to something deeper, a relationship, not just religion. The story reminds us that no matter how long we've walked a certain path, truth has the power to humble, heal, and transform. It challenges us to examine whether we know about God or truly know Him. For an older audience, this lesson resonates deeply. We often look back on life with questions. Did I get it right? Was it enough? Eliav's journey assures us that God's grace is not earned but offered, even in our final chapters. The gates of heaven are not closed to those who come late, only to those who refuse to come. His testimony is a quiet but urgent call to let go of pride, fear, and self-righteousness, and to embrace the one who sees us fully and loves us still. In the end, faith is not about perfect knowledge, but about the humility to receive perfect love.